Hello, and welcome back to The Canadians. I'm your host, Jared Michael. Here at The Canadians, we attempt to understand Canada's contrarians. We believe contrarians are sometimes the only people holding valuable information the rest of society desperately needs. Today's guest is Glynis Sherwood, a psychotherapist, author, and the pioneer of scapegoating theory. For decades, Glynis has worked with individuals and families affected by scapegoating, a dynamic where one person, often a child, becomes burdened with blame for deeper dysfunctions inside the system itself. But as she argues throughout this conversation, these patterns do not stay confined to the family. Similar dynamics can emerge in workplaces, political movements, online culture, and public life more broadly. At the center of scapegoating is often a breakdown in self-reflection. When someone raises concerns that would require a group to examine its own behavior, it can become easier to redirect the tension onto the person raising the concern instead. We begin by exploring how these dynamics form inside families, particularly in homes shaped by untreated personality disorders, emotional instability, and shame-based environments. Glynis explains how children raised in these systems often internalize the belief that they themselves are the problem, carrying those injuries far into adulthood. From there, we widen the lens outward. We discuss how similar patterns can emerge in public culture through online shaming, ideological group behavior, and social media environments that reward performance over reflection. Glynis also shares her concerns about pornography, young men, and the broader emotional health of the culture. We spend time discussing recovery, including why many survivors of scapegoating become deeply thoughtful parents themselves, despite never having healthy models for attachment or emotional regulation. Along the way, we talk about her book, Finding Freedom, along with the extensive body of essays and resources available through her website, all of which are linked in the show notes. This is a wide-ranging conversation about scapegoating, shame, family systems, public culture, and what happens when groups lose the ability to honestly reflect on themselves. Here is my conversation with Glynis Sherwood. Glynis Sherwood, welcome to The Canadians. It's a real honor to have you on the show today.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Jared.
I discovered your work when a close friend of mine was going through some personal issues in their family life, and I was trying to make sense of what they're going through, and they pointed me to your website and to your massive blog you have there with like over 100 articles you've published, and I started working my way through those articles, and I was intrigued right away because I saw that you were kind of identifying patterns or putting words to things that I had kind of just noticed these patterns in my life and relationships, and that intrigued me. And then later on, I saw that you're actually connecting this scapegoating theory that you've kind of pioneered into the public shaming or cancel culture dynamic we've also been seeing playing out in our culture recently. And so, yeah, I thought it'd be really great to have you come on and just talk about that work. And I know you've also, yeah, you're kind enough to forward me an advanced copy of your Finding Freedom, the guidebook that you've developed for survivors of being scapegoated. And so we could also save some time maybe to talk about that. But yeah, that's how I kind of thought maybe we could frame the episode a bit if you're okay with that.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
And I just want to say right off the top that I think you're an amazing friend to take that kind of interest in what's going on with your friend, to take a real depth dive so that you can understand what this terrible problem is all about and be really supportive, based on that wisdom and knowledge that you've gleaned.
Yeah, well, they reciprocate as that kind of friend too. So it's, but
Right.
yeah. And so maybe we could start right at the beginning. You've kind of pioneered this work, and I know other people have picked it up, but you've put a lot of time into this. So maybe you could just start us off by just getting us going by explaining what scapegoating theory is, how you define it, and how it shows up.
Well, in a nutshell, scapegoating is bullying, and in the context where I started out, just primarily focusing on family dynamics, the scapegoat is usually a child. There are often more than one child that's been singled out as the problem person in the family. So usually there's some degree of family dysfunction that's going on either with one or both parents. Usually there's some degree of narcissistic spectrum disorder, although some therapists don't agree that that all families that scapegoat have narcissistic dynamics. I just can't see it, because of the lack of empathy towards the scapegoated person who is usually villainized for reasons that have not a lot to do with them. Usually there's some sort of person who's like the canary in the coal mine. Like they raise the problems that are going on in the family, and they raise they put a finger at what's happening, and because of that, they're vilified for that. Usually, there's an aura of secrecy that goes on in families like this, where we pretend that everything is okay, or we don't talk about it. So the scapegoated child, if it starts in childhood, and it does for a lot of people, is identified as the problem, because they refuse to remain silent, or they look unhappy and they're depressed or anxious because of the family dysfunction. Sometimes it happens just because the child is different from the other members of the family. Like the family could be, I don't know, like um, coal miners, and this person is artistic or something,
Right.
and they just don't fit in. There's some kind of an outlier. But more often than not, I find that it's tethered to like family pathology that's not being addressed, and it is really running the show.
And so what's the consequences that occurring to it? Like, that must be just the formative years, the why, how does that affect the wiring of an individual being raised under that dynamic?
Well, I think that the main injury that it causes is a shame-based identity, because when kids come into the world, one of their primary roles of a parent is to be a good enough mirror to the child. So that the good enough mirror parent is saying to the child, um, you know, I love you. You're a beautiful child. Sometimes you make mistakes, but I love you nevertheless. And then when the child is optimally parented by that enough, they internalize that, and that becomes the scaffolding of the self.
Right.
For children that are scapegoated, they're awfulized. They're basically villainized by the family, and that can start in it could start in the womb. If the mother's ambivalent about the pregnancy and the child just to begin with. So if the child comes into the world unwanted and is getting a lot of messages about how they're a bad child, that's what the child internalizes as their identity, and they come to believe that they're bad. So this is where shame tends to seep in and sets it up into the personality, where the child comes to believe that they're kinda, like, born bad, and a lot of the messaging they usually get in the family is, "If only you could be better, different, somebody else, you would be loved." But it's a total setup, because even if the child caters to that, they're never accepted, loved, or welcomed into the fold. So it's kind of like a lure that the child gets, believing that somehow if they can fix themselves, they'll fit in. But it's I've rarely seen this happen, and in the case of a narcissistic parent, the narcissists defend themselves by projecting onto other people are bad and they're amazing, right? It's never gonna happen, right? So it sets up false hope for the child.
Right.
So they carry that shame-based identity, believing they're flawed or, like, inherently defective into adulthood,
Right.
either consciously or unconsciously. So it hijacks their belief system about who they are. It interferes with their relationships. It interferes with their capacity for intimacy. It interferes with their sense of self, identity in terms of who am I? How do I want to spend my time as a human being? What kind of career path might I take? It produces a lot of lost souls, a lot of grief and depression. It can cause complex trauma, which is kind of like PTSD combined with low self worth. So it's kind of like PTSD on steroids. A lot, and if there's violence that's going on in these family homes too, it amplifies the problem. So it's really, really devastating experience for any child or a young person to have. It can happen later in life. Say for example, if somebody finds themselves hooking up as somebody who's a wolf in sheep's clothing, or they're brought into a dysfunctional family, that can have devastating consequences too. But I don't think anybody is as vulnerable as they are psychologically as when they're a child.
Right. Yeah.
Most adults have some kind of resilience, and if they've been parented okay, just having to fall into that kind of dynamic, they may not fare as badly. But then again, there's no guarantees. It depends on what's going on. I have clients who've had partners who are clearly psychopathic.
Right.
And that's what one of the audience groups that my book was written for, is people coming out of intimate relationships with people who are psychopathic.
So the childhood dynamic is one of the main ones where something can start, and I guess that can probably trigger the whole cycles of abuse or cycles of, because those people grow up and must, struggle as parents as well. And I'm not sure how that would continue. Is like, would they, yeah, how does that manifest? Is like, as those people grow up and try to get into relationships and are raising children, if they don't heal those things, what do they end up passing on to the next generation?
Well, many things. One would be anxiety. A lot of people who are raised in these kinds of environments suffer with chronic anxiety, and that's often the best case scenario. They might have chronic depression. They might have post-traumatic stress. It's like a lot of either intrusive symptoms like nightmares or flashbacks, or numbing, conversely, where they don't feel a lot. They seem to be in a dissociative state, what's called a functional freeze a lot. Um, they would experience a parent perhaps who has low self-worth, who has difficulty regulating their emotions, particularly difficult emotions, and they might end up taking it out on the child.
Yeah.
On the other hand, they could be excellent parents, because they don't want to replicate what they've been
Right.
through
Yeah.
themselves. So like it really depends on how conscious I think a person is and how willing they are to concretely deal with these sorts of problems.
And you're saying these situations, so you were saying that the childhood one is a common one, but this dynamic can manifest in other scenarios with a partner, I imagine with other family members and the extended family members. And you talk about narcissism, and narcissism gets brought up a lot in today's culture. And I have a lot of murkiness around it. I don't fully understand, because, like, social media seems very narcissistic. It just seems as a trend we've become over generations more narcissistic as, we've developed these technologies. But then you also hear there's this narcissistic disorder that is like a clinical disorder. And so you mentioned the word spectrum, like where is it go from like a clinical diagnosis of narcissistic disorder to just being self-centered or selfish? Is there a spectrum there, or how do you define narcissism?
Yeah, well, first of all, you're correct. I mean, the word narcissism is ubiquitous, but I don't think many people understand what it actually means. So people can have traits of narcissism, which is across a spectrum, and then they can be formally diagnosed having a narcissistic personality disorder. When you get that diagnosis, there's usually not a spectrum within that diagnostic framework. You either are or you aren't. But it tends to be more of the North American model, where people are using the DSM. Do you know what that is?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. But in other parts of the world, they use something called the ICD, which is the International Classification of Diseases, which I actually think is more sophisticated and nuanced,
Huh.
even though it was put out by the World Health Organization. And they have one diagnosis, which is personality disorder with, and then they say narcissism, or antisocial personality disorder, or borderline personality disorder. And they identify that people can have different manifestations of those disorders, possibly going on at the same time, or that one can shift into another form possibly at later stages in life. But when we're talking about traits, that's across the spectrum.
And so are those cluster B, what you just described there? Or is that
Yes,
what's commonly?
yes.
Okay, so could you
That's
briefly?
the DSM.
Okay, and so I always hear cluster B, like with people with cluster B, there's kind of one things I've heard, and this is just again, just in passing, I don't know how accurate it is just that, with cluster B, one of the things that makes them distinct is that they're really hard to treat. Like those personalities aren't really going to respond to talk therapy, or come around that it's like, and that seems to be maybe a line from just the general way narcissism is used out in the culture. Odd is just, like a lot of people are just selfish, self-centered, but maybe with some work and awareness, they could get better at that. Where
Sure.
is there a distinction between like a hard cluster B personality that is just really hard to manage and something else that's a bit more learned behavior?
Right. Well, cluster B is a subcategory in the DSM of personality disorders, and these are considered to be the erratic and dramatic disorders. And there's four of them. There's borderline personality, histrionic personality, narcissistic personality, and antisocial personality. And so what I'm talking about is on a severity continuum. Somebody with antisocial personality disorder is much harder to treat. Some would say untreatable than somebody with borderline
Right.
personality
Okay.
disorder. So a borderline personality disorder actually has a much better treatment profile for people that are willing and able to identify that they have a problem that they need to get help with. Narcissism is a very challenging disorder to treat, and not with a great deal of success. And I think antisocial, like I just pointed out, is almost impossible. And the far end of the antisocial continuum is psychopathy. It's just definitely untreatable.
Okay. And so how common do you think narcissism is in our
Well,
culture?
according to the DSM, it's about 2 to 3% of the population. But I think the number of people who actually have traits across the spectrum is probably upwards to about maybe 1/5.
Wow. Holy.
Yeah, yeah.
I've read essays kind of making the argument that we're kind of our culture's taking on a cluster B like aspect. What do you think of that claim?
I think this is true, and I think it's been aided and abetted by the internet.
Could you expand? Like, what do people mean by that when they say the culture's taking
Well,
on a cluster?
primarily social media, which platforms people to kind of showcase their lives as a performance, where they're trying to gather an audience of admirers who pedestalize them. And I think that like a lot of these platforms were created by people who do have narcissistic tendencies, like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk for sure. So they were designed to create that sort of dynamic where people create a spectacle out of their lives, where they want to be witnessed and admired,
And,
and it draws a lot of attention-seeking people.
and so what about the fact that that's just like everyday culture now for youth? Like if you look at like the youth in my life, it's just like they go out and get some pizza and go play some smash ball in the park. Probably don't do that actually. They're probably doing something on their screens. But anyways, they turn that into an Instagram story and then they post it up, so everybody can just, see what you and I just did every day with our friends and didn't think twice about documenting it for other people to see.
Right,
You went off in
right.
the woods and we just played, and whereas now it
And
seems
the
like
memories stayed up here.
yeah, and where now it seems like every youth is just doing whatever they do that night is being put into an Instagram story so everybody else can see it. So where does that fit into? Like that doesn't what happens when everybody's doing that?
Well, I think what happens is what I just talked about. When people turn their lives into dramas that they think need to be presented to audiences of people that don't know them, so that people can validate them or look up to them
Right,
and
right.
follow them. Um, I think it appeals to a sense of being important, um, perhaps more important than the message you're actually sending. I think it sets people up to be very vulnerable to that kind of affirmation as well. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of people on social media who have wonderful pages and platforms, and I think are doing a lot of work, but it's intermingled with all of this other stuff.
Uh,
And you could get a lot of like really negative influencers on there, like the manosphere, which I think has been one of the deadliest things that's happened to boys in our culture. Um, and of course, like a Netflix special just came out about it, so there's a
uh,
lot more people are getting up to speed about what this is all about. But I'd say that the men who are pushing the manosphere narrative are primarily either psychopathic or narcissistic.
right, right. Yeah.
Yeah, very antisocial. Woman hating messages. So it can cause a lot of polarization. a lot of us against them, kind of tribalism. I think it just operates on this black and white framework, and that's the downside. And a lot of people compare themselves to others, and who've curated their lives on screen, and these aren't actually the lives that they're living, and they feel jealous or one down or like a loser. Or,
Yeah.
so I think it causes a lot of depression. There's a lot of predatory behavior that goes on in social media, particularly male to female predation. That I'm aware of and really concerned about. 1 in 5 young children, have been contacted by a man online who has sexual interest in them. 1 in 5.
Yeah, like Jonathan Haidt's line that we're overprotecting children in the physical world and underprotecting them in the digital
Yeah,
world. Yeah,
yeah. So it has lots of cracks and holes for dark forces to swoop in and infect things without a lot of gatekeeping functions, because I think the people that created these platforms couldn't care less about it,
chasing
quite
attention.
frankly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and so and
They make a lot of money off it.
And so social media, we're talking about all these new, bringing all these dynamics in. How do you see it playing out? And I imagine scapegoating theory applied, before the internet, it would have, I'm sure, been around. But so what has the effect of social media been specifically on scapegoating theory,
Yeah,
scapegoating?
yeah. Well, I mean, we think about it, scapegoating is old as time. Jesus was the first most popular scapegoat that I think everybody's aware of. Sorry, would you mind asking me the question again?
I was wondering specifically social media, the amplification it has on scapegoating culture itself. Like, yeah, what effect did the introduction of social media have on scapegoating culture?
Well, it's created a place where it can be open season on people. Like I see people on there, um, often they're just trying to present reasonable information, and then they're under attack in the comments section, in like really vicious, uncivil ways that people wouldn't talk to each other in person. But all of this is allowed, so people can get on there and attack somebody and then egg each other on in the comments, and people who have a different point of view can get on there, and it can become a gigantic pile up, like a mobbing situation, which is group scapegoating. And then if the attacks escalate enough, they could theoretically destroy somebody's life,
Yeah.
by discrediting them, um, by having them deplatformed. I've seen people who have very reasonable platforms have their platforms taken down because the opposing side complained about them, unfairly. So, th- I it, c- these platforms, because they don't have tight enough controls, enable darker personalities to get away with this kind of behavior. And most of the trolls online are teenage boys.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Uh-huh. So, I mean, not in all cases, but the vast majority are like 15 to 19-year-old boys.
Right. What's the
So,
psychology there? They just want to troll people?
yeah, so it's some kind of, I mean, like going back to what I was talking about, the red pill bros and the manosphere guys had a big influence on these young males online, and any antisocial tendencies that they might have had to begin with are just enabled through these platforms.
Right. So, you did just write a book, a handbook. It was on how to help survivors of this stuff. Like maybe we could get into just because this is all pretty heavy stuff happening to people. And yeah, if you have been someone who's grown up under this environment or currently, having to deal with this dynamic for some reason in any situation you're in, what are some steps you can take to help yourself?
Um, well, I think it's important to find credible resources, to help you make sense of your experience. To recognize that if this is what's happened to you, that you've been victimized and likely psychologically injured. A lot of people think that they're unwell or ill, and being abused can cause mental disorders. But the way that I frame it is through the lens of injury. That these are injuries inflicted on a whole person by somebody who's not whole, or possibly a group of people, because often it happens, in gangs or groups. So find the resources that help you understand what's happened to you. I got a ton of resources on my site that explains kind of the nuts and bolts as to what this is all about. Um, Clearly understanding that you've been victimized, and which is not the same as developing a victim identity, but the reality of being victimized, I think, has to be acknowledged. I think people have to figure out that, that they've likely been traumatized by this kind of treatment, especially if it happened in childhood. And then in that case, you want to hopefully be able to work with somebody who has the experience and the wherewithal to be able to assist you appropriately with these kinds of injuries. Um, you have to be able to break through the programming that's happened to you. I think that people that have been through these kinds of horrendous childhood experiences are are basically similar to people that have been in cults, and I've used scapegoating families as cults.
Right.
So there's a lot of brainwashing that goes on in these kinds of systems, where the person has learned to awfulize themselves. They have a lot of shame-based beliefs. They may feel constantly keyed up and on edge, have very low self-worth. So these are problems with trauma that have to be worked through. And often I would think that people could benefit from doing therapy with somebody who's familiar with this problem, because not everybody is. I'd say even today, although things have really improved since I started focusing on this area about 12 years ago, there's still a paucity of therapists who understand how to, or even coaches who know how to work with this issue. Um, People just don't have the background and the knowledge base in a lot of cases to be able to handle these situations appropriately. And unfortunately, what can happen is that we can end up with a lot of victim blaming that goes on,
Right.
because people don't understand the reality of one-sided abuse. Like like our culture believes in a lot of myths, like it takes two to tango.
Right. Right.
Being one of them, which is not the case
Right.
when people have been subjected to this kind of abuse. The other thing that people have to look at is there's usually a lot of grief that people are carrying as a result of having not been parented properly, like not getting the kind of parenting that they needed and will never get. So there's often a lot of grief work that has to be done, and then there's some tougher decisions around, should I go no contact with my family or low contact? I mean, we're in an age now where people can go no contact sometimes for which can seem like knee-jerk reasons, and that is happening a bit more, but most people for the most part, do not go no contact with their family unless something really horrendous has happened. A lot of research backs up the idea that most people would rather be dead than not be a member of their family,
Right. Yeah.
even if their families don't really have anything to offer them, and, um, no contact is often the only way that somebody can survive psychologically the trauma of continuing to be in a family system like this. Because if you're dealing with narcissistic parents, or people who are on the spectrum, psychopathic parents, even borderline parents, these disorders don't soften with age. So I mean, you could be dealing with that kind of family dynamic until the offending parent passes away.
Right. Yeah.
So there's usually some breaks or boundaries that need to be put into the situation so the person can protect themselves and deal with any kind of false blame or false guilt that's been embedded in them about how they're supposed to be the family punching bag, but at the same time be responsible for taking care of other people. That's a dynamic I see really frequently, and sometimes people can't get totally untangled from this. For example, say you have a child with a narcissistic partner, then they're going to have to be part of your life
Right.
to some extent, at least until the child is grown up.
Yeah.
And I help people figure out how to navigate that. Or you're caring for an elderly parent. Most of the people that I work with who have been scapegoated are extremely kind and conscientious people.
Right.
And often they're the most together member of their own family. So a lot of them can end up because they're empathic, taking care of the parent that abused them in old age.
Right. Right. Yeah.
It's just really rough,
Yeah.
And ultimately, although I think no contact is the safest place to be, it's not something that everybody can or will do, So it depends on your own philosophy of life, and certainly, if somebody's caretaking an abusive parent because they feel like that's the right thing to do, um, I'm not going to oppose that idea, but I would certainly explore it with them, because people's ideas around this can often change over time. Like a
Yeah.
lot of people hope that they can have some real kind of relationship with an abusive person, but more often than not, it just proves to be something they can't navigate.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just too hard to deal with psychologically.
So this is quite it can really, you're describing like something that could be, you could be 50 years old and still, or just even first coming to terms at 50 years old with a lifetime.
Absolutely.
And then you could also, this dynamic could also be present in someone who just gets counseled at work and they're 50 years old and has had a relatively well-regulated life. And then this happens, but you still see that same dynamic at play in both situations here.
I'd have to say it depends. I think if somebody's canceled at work, um, and they come from a healthy family background, that's going to be fortifying for them, and do not in any way diminish the devastation of an experience like that, because in a lot of canceling situations, what the result is, what I was talking to you about earlier, is moral injury.
Right.
Where people, their sense of a just world or believing in a just world is inverted, when they feel like they're being punished for doing the right thing.
Hmm.
This is a very, very difficult thing for people to come to terms with, and psychologically, it's quite devastating. So I can't really generalize about that. I think that the individual's psychological structure, in a situation like that where you're middle aged and you're canceled at work, is going to have a big influence. And also, like, do you have another source of income? Is there something else that you can do? Do you have a supportive family? Do you have somebody at home who's working? While this is happening to you, is going to take care of things. Or are you just out in the cold, with no source of income and maybe children to raise, like teenagers at that age? So I think it's such a subjective thing, but people who were scapegoated as children who find themselves in that kind of situation, it can be crushed, like
Right.
completely devastated and possibly not returned.
But the work person in the work scenario was scapegoated still. They might,
But they,
you still consider that scapegoating. They were in those scenarios, they could be considered scapegoated as still.
Absolutely,
Okay.
because
Yeah.
it, scapegoating is bullying.
Yeah.
So I think and being canceled at work, unless you're some kind of a monster, or which is, I think, rare. Usually people are canceled for having like a difference of opinion, or a different political affiliation, or something like that. Then they're being deliberately attacked and injured for just having a different point of view.
Uh,
So that's different than somebody who behaves egregiously,
yeah.
having their feet held to the fire at work. Um, and if they have been scapegoated in childhood, I think that they're going to fare harder than they might if they hadn't been, because it's like these kinds of psychological injuries, the damage of them is cumulative,
Yeah.
just as any kind of a stressor is cumulative. So people don't get fortified by this stuff. They might have seen it before, but I think it could absolutely completely devastate somebody, if they come to experience the world just as hostile and punitive, when you're innocent or just trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about another trend I've noticed, and I don't know if there's any studies or research done on it, and I don't know if it's a trend I've just noticed as I've gotten older in life, but I've noticed, I'm noticing pockets and many cases of older people in my life, specifically like grandparents, who seem to be getting cut out of their kids' lives more and more. Like I was talking to a group of 7 women, older women that all work, and 4 of them had all been cut out of their kids' lives, and they all thought unjustifiably, like just over a small, like, is there any is that a trend? Is there any research in that? And is that just is that have to do with scapegoating theory at all?
Well, that this isn't really my field, but I'm aware of what you're talking about, and I've I've really only heard about it anecdotally. Like I talked to one person who told me that their therapist told them that and this is in the States because I work as a coach in around the world as well, and I work primarily as a therapist in Canada. But this American-based person was telling me that their therapist had told them that they should stop talking to their family members who had voted for Trump.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Just completely eliminate them from their lives,
Yeah.
And I was like, "What?" Um, people need to think really long and hard about what the implications are for, um, erasing somebody from their lives because they have these differences of opinions, because the ripple effects can be quite costly.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's terrible advice for any therapist to be giving somebody, to completely cut off a family member because they voted differently than you did.
Yeah, it just seems anecdotally, there's just seems to be so many tripwires in our culture today that I could see how particularly older generations too have always been a bit more fall prey to those changing cultural trends over time. They don't keep
Right.
up with the right vocabulary, don't, and it feels like that phenomenon has been amplified more than ever now, that there's just a whole army of minefield you kind of have to walk through. So I could see how that could trigger people to, um,
Yeah.
yeah, say, what, do you have any ways you can see us, maybe working our culture away from scapegoating? What kind of skills or tools we have to equip people with in order to try to create a bit more of a open and forgiving society again?
I think that we need to focus more on character. The whole idea of promoting and supporting the development of what sounds kind of old fashioned now. It used to be called character in people, rather than showcasing people. Things like moral education, teaching people to be kind, teaching people to be empathic. I think these things should be part of the school curriculum,
Mhm.
and they are in some parts of the world.
Right. Yeah.
And it's helping people to develop empathy, things like that, and promoting people socially who exhibit these kinds of traits, because I think there's been a loss of the value of well, I guess what you call like the traditional values, like the golden rule,
Right.
like do unto others as you have done to yourself, right?
Mhm.
I think that we need to go back to these fundamental moral principles to educate and guide our societies. And in the past, historically, this was the role of elders, is to be able to pass on these kinds of tradition, with the idea that, as you age, you should gather some wisdom around you that you can share with other people.
Mhm.
I mean, this is certainly not something that you see platformed on social media. So I think we've lost contact with a lot of these anchors, that help people to be able to focus on what's important, for the survival of our species, moving away from instant gratification or showcasing oneself, and competitively trying to get likes and followers, but the message is fundamentally hollow, or adversarial.
Yeah, it feels like psychologists and counselors and therapists might play a special role today in that, because it is like all these incentives are pushing us people in that direction. But it's people like yourself who are seeing the harmful consequences and can speak to it. And so, as we're starting to see places pushing back against kids having social media and phones, but I think it took us having to gather the evidence that, this might not be the greatest things for children to be.
Yeah, and I think phones shouldn't be allowed in classrooms. We've got this situation now where the kids run everything, and there's a loss of kind of like moral authority in leadership roles, which is really problematic. Children shouldn't be running things.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
so
you would support not just even phones? Would you support like children not being on social media till a certain age as well?
possibly, possibly, I'd have to think about that some more. And I mean, but also there's the practical aspects of this. I mean, how does one prevent it?
Yeah.
Like I have a friend who's got a 2-year-old, and they're talking about not wanting to buy their child a phone. When they're little, with the trend is most kids have phones, but they have phones, and the kid's already watching videos on a screen. So I think
Oh,
it's very hard to supervise it and police it, because that's where everybody believes the action is, especially when they're young.
yeah.
But it's kind of like the Wild West too, and I don't think it's safe, and I don't think it's safe for young people, and I particularly don't think it's safe for females.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It almost feels like, it's going to be hard to find an easy top down solution. It feels like it has to kind of come from the culture bottom up or something where parent.
Yeah. There has to be some kind of moral authority, um, for example, I think pornography should be illegal. Like all
Uh,
those sites should be taken down. But it would be easy enough to do, but it's probably never going to happen. This is where a lot of negative influence is coming from. It's the manosphere and then pornography, because that's where most boys are getting their sexual education from. So nowadays, it's not uncommon for an 11-year-old boy to be looking at porn of a man punching a woman in the face or choking her while he's anally having sex with her.
right.
So I think this is like, it's deviant, and it's highly, highly problematic because sex and violence have been conflated.
I've been trying to find someone to get on the show to talk about this very issue, just specifically the effect of, everyday easy access to all types of porn for boys and men, and what the effect that is having on
Yeah.
them and the culture. Because it feels like that's another one of those places we're just underprotecting, not even thinking about it, or giving like 13-year-old boys fully loaded iPhones that they can just go right on Pornhub. And yeah, that's got to be just doing devastating things to their
Yeah,
minds.
it's really scary, So, um, I heard from one mom who her 14-year-old daughter told her that a girl's first sexual experience these days is the teenage boys expect
Right.
anal
Yeah.
intercourse.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's horrifying.
Yeah. That's horrifying for everybody. Because like, why that shouldn't be the boy shouldn't be thinking that way in the first place either. Like that's not a
Right, but
healthy.
this is what they're told is normal, and
Yeah.
apparently it's tighter, and they like that. That I finally somebody finally told me why that's a preference, because it's tighter.
Right. Yeah. Like,
Uh,
yeah.
because these boys tend to be chronic masturbators, they're using a lot of friction.
Right.
So,
Right.
and they get used to it, and
Uh,
so the anal feels more like that.
I'm surprised that many of these boys will even get to the point of having a first sexual encounter. I think, it's stunting so many people's natural healthy growth just to even go out and meet people and talk to
Yeah,
people and get in real life
absolutely.
relationships. Yeah.
Yeah, and I read something somewhere where I can't remember the source, but they said males find masturbating to porn as emotionally satisfying as in-person sex.
Right. Yeah.
And it concluded there, because there's no emotion involved at all, if that's what they equate emotional satisfaction with.
Yeah.
What emotion? There's none.
I could just see how more complicated a real life interaction will be. Now you just can't get what you want all the time. You can't just have full control over the situation. Now it's just, yeah, I could see it's not good. It's
Right, and this is where my scapegoating theory extends, like, more and more lately, is because, I believe that women are scapegoated by patriarchy. So, of course, it's gonna extend out into these areas, and one of the things I do observe on social media, I don't know, maybe it's because the algorithms have pinpointed me for this, is that there's a lot of pushback from women against patriarchy, and there's a lot of men that get on there and try to pile on these women, you know?
Right.
So there seems to be some kind of sea change that's going on where women have just had enough of this. So I'm hoping that that's going to be some sort of positive, ongoing social trend. But I mean, you don't want to be observing like 40-year-olds having these fist fights on social media. You want to be able to get to, boys when they're 10 years old,
Yeah.
because they're going to turn into it, they can potentially turn into little monsters by the time they're 14 or 15 years old. The most sexually dangerous group of males now is 15 to 19-year-olds. They perpetrate the largest number of sexual assaults.
Really? Wow. Wow.
I know, I couldn't believe it either.
Yeah.
These are guys who go to high school during the day and they come home and mom cooks them dinner.
Wow, really?
And then by night they go out and rape their girlfriends.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's alarming. That's yeah, I'm not sure what we that's a slow battle. I guess one thing where I get hope sometimes is just that I feel our education system is in such a terrible place right now that there's an opportunity there that if we can make it better, like you say, like put this stuff right into the education system from kindergarten on, you know?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think our race, the human race is counting on people to do this, but I don't know if there's the wherewithal. But I think it starts with admitting that problems exist. And no matter what level of scapegoating you're looking at, whether it's the family scapegoat, which is where I started out, or the scapegoating of women, where we have to admit we live in a patriarchal society, or what can happen in intimate partner abuse, or what's going on when people get canceled in the workforce. These things have to be challenged out loud. They need to be said out loud. But I don't think people are connecting the dots like as much as they need to.
Yeah, it's hard. Our news isn't doing a very good job of explaining things to people in a way that helps understand, because I think we're in such a complicated situation right now that it kind of demands a lot of attention, and people are busy, and I don't think necessarily.
I think those are excuses. It's like, what are your priorities? Where there's the will, these things can happen overnight.
Yeah, yeah,
But it's like follow the money.
yeah, yeah,
What earns income is going to probably be hanging around, and I probably don't need to tell you that. Something like porn is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
yeah.
And in fact, something like Pornhub. One of the owners of Pornhub is a rabbi in Montreal.
Oh, really? Wow.
A
I did not
rabbi,
know
a
that.
man
Yeah,
of God.
yeah. Well, it sounds like Pornhub's collapsing under the pressure of OnlyFans now.
Yeah. Well, also Layla Mickleweight is a woman who wrote a book that exposed Pornhub, and she's bringing Pornhub down almost
Yeah,
single-handedly.
yeah, yeah. It's impressive.
But the legislators could stop this stuff in a moment, if they wanted to.
Right. Yeah. And
I
why?
mean, I worked in the government. I've seen situations where if the government wants something to happen, they can do it in 4 hours.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's some problems we have in our culture right now that I think are going to take a long time to fix. And then there's others that we could fix overnight. Like if we just, if we just had the will there to do it, it's
Just pull the plug.
yeah, that's well, speaking of solutions, maybe we can talk about finding freedom for a moment, the book you wrote. Yeah, what that it's not released quite yet, is it?
Yes, it's for sale on my
Oh, it
site.
is for sale on your site right now. Okay. Yeah, do you
Yeah.
want to speak about the book and why you wrote it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, primarily I'm an essayist, so I write a lot of feature articles about the subject. But what I decided to do was to write a guidebook for people who maybe can't afford to go to therapy or won't make it into coaching, or that basically covers the ground that I do in my sessions with people. So it's a self-reflective book where people can go from A to Z in terms of dealing with the kinds of recovery steps and trajectory that the people that I work with one-on-one undergo when they're doing the individual work. So it's written as like a journal, and I ask people a lot of self-reflective questions that are called healing prompts in the book. and they can reflect on that and sit with it. It covers traumatic stress and anxiety management. It covers reparenting, which is like taking care of the wounded child. This is primarily speaks to the family scapegoat who might be sitting inside of you, running things, who's in a state of distress. Um, Reclaiming the true narrative of who you actually might be from the cult programming that I referred to earlier. Grieving the loss of family. There's often tremendous grief for folks. Safety planning, all of that kind of stuff, especially for people who are leaving intimate partner abuse situations. And it also covers things like, how do you have a healthy relationship with somebody? Like, how do you set boundaries? So I teach things like a method called laddering, where, when you first get to know somebody, this is how you might ease into the situation gradually so you can assess whether or not they're a trustworthy person, that kind of thing. People that come from these kind of family backgrounds are often at a real loss because they weren't modeled any kind of healthy relationship dynamics.
Hmm.
So it's like kind of like flying by the seat of your pants. So some of the work that I do is it's more like guidance, where I have to help people learn to do things that they weren't taught as a child.
Hmm.
Like how do you assess whether or not somebody is friendship material, never mind an intimate partner, because a lot of people can get into a situation with friends where they're just not choosing right. They don't know how to prioritize themselves. They don't know how to pick people who maybe don't have some of the same qualities that their parents do, where they could end up with narcissistic friends or partners, or they don't believe that they deserve more,
Right.
so then it's kind of like a doormat thing. So the book was written as it's a self-help book, basically, so people can work on these things on their own.
Yeah, I found, I've seen it's hard to not come across self-help books in these days. And I found yours, though, it's very short. It's like, it's not like a long, thick, heavy book. I found it really readable. It felt like almost like sitting in the room with you and, talking. It was not an academic kind of self-help book at all. I found it, and it felt like there's like principles of cognitive behavioral therapy where that was that kind of interspersed throughout it. We're using that as a tool.
Somewhat. I'm not like a pure CBT therapist. My background is more in psychodynamics, and that's getting at the unconscious material
Okay.
that might be running somebody's life, and it deals with history, and generational issues, so it's a combination of both. But what I'm often addressing, like especially when I'm trying to help people overcome uh, programming or conditioning, is how their beliefs have gotten hijacked,
Right. Yeah.
by the family narrative or the narrative of the abusive partner, because a lot of these systems use nefarious techniques to control people, like gaslighting,
Right. Yeah.
in manipulation. For example, if that goes on day after day for a child, they're just completely tidal waved by that, and they start believing these things. Often this stuff can be humming in the background of your unconscious mind. It's really hard to get at, but it comes out in low moods or your thought processes. So I suppose that the tie-in to CBT is like getting at what the beliefs are that are controlling your feelings of worthlessness, for example. But unlike CBT, it goes into the unconscious processes, and those can be a lot harder to get at. And the unconscious mind, of course, is where all memory gets stored until somebody is old enough to talk.
So is this what you're
And
calling the schemas in the book?
yes,
Okay.
yeah, there's schemas. So they're belief systems that we run on, So I guess you could say from this point of view, my work has more in common with schema therapy than it does with CBT. But they all have interlapping or overlapping similarities. But CBT tends to deal more with the conscious processes that people have.
Right. I could see the difficulty of dealing with the unconscious patterns you have. These are the things you do without thinking about it. It's
Right,
I
right.
guess
But
that's the reprogramming you're talking about.
right, but the thoughts are there, or the behaviors are there. Like, why am I acting in such a self-destructive way? So you have to start working backwards. And I
Uh,
I use different techniques to do that. For example, I'm a certified hypnotherapist, So I do hypnotherapy work with people. Sometimes the nervous system has to be regulated better. Most people who have been through these kinds of dynamics since early childhood are in a really high state of anxiety,
Right.
and even when they're asleep.
Right.
It's like they're tense all the time, because they're hypervigilant. They've learned to be hypervigilant. It's kind of like living in a war zone,
Right.
right? So you can't really calm down even when you need to. So those areas have to be addressed too. My book touches on that a little bit. I tend to do more of that kind of work in person, and I think these pieces can be more effective if you can do them in person with
Right.
somebody who knows how to work this way more somatically. Somatic just means the body.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So you're using like it's in the unconscious. So you use the behaviors, the thoughts, and I guess the emotions. You mentioned you trusting your emotions in this scenario as well to guide you into your unconscious then?
Yes, and it's like somebody might feel chronically hopeless, and that could come from it could be their origin story, because that's the way that they felt as a 2-year-old child. So you have to have some way of being able to access that.
Hmm.
And the work that I do, which also is largely informed by the work that I studied as learning to be a couples therapist, has really helped me to become a much better individual therapist.
Right.
One guy I studied with in particular, his name is Terry Real in Boston. He helps people access the wounded child, and all trauma survivors from childhood have a wounded child in there, and often they're the part of them that's running the show, behind the scenes. It's the part of them that gets defensive. It's the part of them that can be defiant. It's the part of them that can be self-destructive, but that this kid thinks that they're trying to protect you. So these are things that can't be easily accessed through um, cognitions. So this is where CBT falls short, I think. I don't think CBT is a complete system,
Hmm.
even though it's pedestalized because the medical profession likes it.
Right.
But it's a partial system. So it's one of the systems that I use. Almost all therapists know CBT. But I'm an interdisciplinary therapist, and I've just
Right.
found over the years that I'm not really wedded to any particular techniques. I'm interested in what
Works.
works.
Okay. I guess, yeah, that's a good way to go.
Yeah, and a lot of that's like trial and error. When I first started doing this work, there was hardly anybody that was helping people who've been scapegoated, and I just kind of stumbled into it. Like I just started writing some articles for people because this was coming up a lot in the work that I was doing, and then I started hearing from people all over the world.
Oh,
Is that I can't believe this is a thing. I thought I was the only one.
right. Yeah.
Y
Wow.
you know?
How validating it
At
must be. Yeah.
Yeah, so at the time, like, I think you can probably count on one hand the number of people who were online doing this sort of work. So I started hearing from, like, hundreds of people all the time,
Wow.
from all over the planet. I work with people all over the world,
Wow. Have you,
because they can't find somebody who does this,
are you
or
able to
they
train other therapists?
uh, someday I hope to, and now that I have a book out, that might help me, but I haven't gotten that far in my thinking, but I
Yeah.
think it would be really important to do that.
Yeah.
Um, but sometimes it's connected to credentialing too, so which is a whole other story.
Right. Yeah. Well, maybe, do you have a success story you could tell us? Like, seeing like how is, what is possible for people?
Well, I think you can never erase the injury. I mean, that's reality. If you have a compound fracture in your leg, you're probably not gonna be the marathon runner that you once were, right? Like,
Hmm.
these kinds of abuses are so deep and fundamental that they change the landscape, I think, of who the person is, um, eh, for better and for worse, So, I think people can heal a shame-based identity because I see that all the time, and I'd say that's the most important piece of the work that I do, is to help people reclaim their true narrative. Like, who were you really, when you were born? you were born into the world as an innocent child. How can you rediscover your essence? And often people have been able to hold on to parts of that, like they're empathic, or they're kind, or they're a principled person. Often it's just getting people to hold on to the reality that they are this person, while there's a voice inside their head, which is the inner critic, that tells them how horrible they are, like, day in and day out, sometimes like all day long. In psychology, this is called the internalized bad object.
Oh, okay.
And object just means another person. So this is a psychodynamic work that people have to do. So if you can tackle the critic, and sometimes it takes years, like literally years, because if these were your first messages,
Mm-hmm.
you're a bad baby,
Yeah.
day in and day out. You're a bad baby, bad child, bad adolescent. Then that's your identity,
Yeah.
on some level, usually. So if people can do the work of challenging this, day in and day out, year in and year out, it's completely possible to lose a shame-based identity. I've helped dozens and dozens and dozens of people to overcome this. Learning how to regulate your nervous system. You can feel calmer than you do, right? Learning how to have better relationships. Like a lot of this stuff is missing information. It's just like, how do you figure out how to do this stuff? So this is where my role as a guy comes in, and I do what I call developmental assists with people. So in this way, I'm a bit different than other therapists. Like, a lot of therapists will tell you that they never give you advice, or they never tell you what to do. I give advice that I call developmental assists.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Like, this is how you recognize a certain situation. This is how you assess a person.
Yeah. That's a real good skill to give somebody. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I often only have to do it once, and then, like, this is all in my book too, how you do things like this. So I think you can definitely end up in a better place. Can you heal 100%? Probably not.
Yeah.
Probably not. There are life experiences that are so shattering that they change a person permanently. But often, like any adversarial situation, if a person has a good character, they're able to parlay it into something better.
Mm-hmm.
Like, some kind of a strength, where they can be like, a loving parent to their children, where they never had that opportunity to experience it themselves, or they do volunteer work, or they're really good to their partner, like they make a point of being this kind of person, like living through example. All of these things, I think, are very healing processes, and a lot of this can be done relationally, not just in the therapist's office.
Right.
Because this is where we live 99% of the time anyway, is out in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Glynis, I'll start wrapping up here and say, wow, we really appreciate all the work you've done and for coming on the show. And just want to say thank you for all of that.
You're welcome.
Okay. And so anything else you want to say just before we say goodbye to everybody?
Well, just to remind people that I've got a lot of information on my website, in my blog. If you're wondering where to start, and you need more information about, what's scapegoating all about, what's the kind of damage it does, what's the healing process, that people can access all that stuff for free. If they want to buy my book, it's only $8. So that's what I would encourage people to do, and to take themselves seriously.
Yeah, that's good advice. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll put all that information in the show notes for people to find if they need to. And yeah, and we'll just say thank you and goodbye to everybody.
Thanks,
goodbye,
Jared.
everybody. Yeah, thank you. Goodbye. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the show, please visit our donations page or subscribe and share with friends. The Canadians, working class roots, a free speech lens, Canadian contrarians.